because we're conditioned not to answer that question for real. And we walk around with a lot of pain, and we miss a lot of opportunity to be supported by people because we're conditioned into not answering that question for real. So I was just saying thank you. Sometimes I'll ask people, I'll be like, hey, how you doing? And they're like, I'm fine. And I'm like, how are you for real, for real? And then fine
Yeah.
is not the answer.
Yeah.
um, so yeah, thank you for
No,
being real.
it's interesting you say that. I think I'm reflecting on that process now, and I think it stems partially from the fact that we are kind of trained to say something
Mm,
when we're around other people, and we don't always know what to say. And so, the colloquial interaction is, how you doing? What's good? And you don't mean it asking it
mm-hmm.
sometimes, right? And
Right.
so you know that you don't always mean it when you ask it,
Mm.
and you never know. It's hard to trust that the person is actually asking. And some of the funniest like comedic bits are about like that moment where you ask someone a question and they go like way too far in
And
the
you're like, no
explanation.
thanks.
No, no, no. It's just supposed to be like a
Yeah,
real quick one, two.
right.
I know
Definitely
you're at
was
the bank
not
teller and
asking
people aren't
all of
talking to
that.
you all day. Yeah. Um, so yeah, no, it's I think it's a practice that I am trying to get into.
Mm.
Uh, you know, if I don't want to know, I think I'm trying to get to a space where I'm just saying hello.
Mm. Yes, instead of asking.
Yeah, instead of asking, because I do it. I do it all the time, and like in passing, and like, and I think there's generationally I notice a difference because like my pop's generation, especially like Southern folk, like
Mhm.
they expect to get into conversations, right? If you say hi, how you doing, what's good, like you stopping for a few
That's
moments to
right.
chat,
That's
right?
right.
And so I'll do it now, and with the older man, I'll be walking past somebody and like, what's good, how you doing, and they start a sentence, and I'm already like 3 steps past them,
Gone.
and so
Mhm.
yeah, it's I think it's important to as especially as a wordsmith, as somebody who claims to craft words in an intentional way, to really think about that.
Yeah.
So
No, I think it's, it's one of those small things that's actually quite big. And I think it's a bit of a gift to be working on because I know if you ask me, then you're asking me.
mm,
Right. So I'm going to take on
mm,
this challenge too because I could certainly be like, hey, good to see you, instead of, hey, how are you? Right? Like, hey,
yeah,
good to see you is not a question and I'm keeping it pushing. But if I ask,
yeah,
how are you? I have the time to be here present with you to hear how you are.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I like that.
Well, thank you. You just gave it to me. So I just took it. Well, then let's jump in. This is Joseph Green. It's so funny. We've only ever met once and been in a documentary together. But I immediately thought of you as a person whose voice I knew I for sure wanted people to hear on the podcast. So this is On Addiction, the podcast. I'm Dr. Nzinga Harrison. Thrilled to be joined here uh, by Joseph Green, whose spirit and humanity shines through. Is the way I would say I experienced you.
It's it's interesting you say that. When I first saw the trailer to the
Mm.
film, I was sure that you were going to be a bigger part of it than you ended up being, like as a whole,
Mm.
because what you said was such an encapsulation of what I think they were going for, and maybe you were too concise for your own good as far as like the final
Hey,
cutting room floor was
concise is not
concerned.
my strength, okay? That's
Yeah.
like the nicest
um,
thing anybody said to me today.
it was such a it landed in a way that I think when I finally did get to meet you in Vegas, that I was more excited than I probably should have been based on how much I actually knew about you as a person. Uh, and I met your husband that day
Uh-huh.
also. And I think, there's family, and then there's people in the world who you feel have a similar way of
Mhm.
seeing the world as you. And there's an instantaneous, like, I know you, and I think that we're fighting for the same thing.
That's how it
And
felt.
like the details don't need to get worked out right now. We're cool. This is going to come back around again at some point, and I'm happy that it did. I'm happy that you're doing this. I do have a question about this though. Can I ask you a
Okay,
question
let's
about
go.
this?
Yeah. He was like,
Tell me about the.
let me turn the
Let
tables.
me turn around. Welcome to your own show. No. Uh, can you just tell me the title? Explain the title to me. Why you went with unaddiction?
Well, I would love to. So, unaddiction is a word that we made up. So the book is available now for pre-sale. You can actually have it in your hands in January. And as I was writing the book, like putting the heart and soul into understanding what addiction is, what puts you at risk for addiction, developing it in the first place, not having it get better, having it ruin people's lives. And so we said we wanted this to be unaddiction, which is what do we need to unlearn that we think we know about addiction? What are the stigmas that we need to undo? And what are the conversations that we need to uncover if we're really going to get our arms around the pain and suffering that is this addiction crisis? And so it was like, we got things to unlearn, we got stigmas to undo, we got conversations to uncover. And it was like, oh, this book is about addiction. So that's how we
There you
came
go.
to it. And
Awesome.
you preempted because at the end of every episode, I ask our guest if there's one thing you want our listeners to unlearn or one stigma that you want our listeners to work towards undoing or one conversation that you want our listeners to uncover, what is it? So that's at the end. I see
Okay,
you. I
so you
see
don't
your
want my
mouth.
answer
I
now. You want
see
me to
your
hold on
mouth
to it?
like you're about to give the answer
Oh
right
no,
now.
I'll
That's
hold
at
on
the
to it. I'll
end.
hold on to it. I'll hold on to it. I'll hold on to that. Y'all gonna have to wait for that.
That's right. You got to wait for
All
that.
right.
So tell us, Joseph. So the film that we were talking about is called Tipping the Pain Scale. It's this incredible documentary. And Joseph and I were both in it. I was a talking head. He was a human, real person with lived experience. um, and we met each other in person on kind of like a screening. And so, Joseph, can you tell our listeners who you are, how you came to be who you are, and what your life is these days?
Is that the first and only question, or should I keep it tight?
No, keep it as
Let it
loose.
run.
Keep it
Let it
as
ride.
loose as you let it run.
Okay. I am a father.
Mm,
Henry and August
mm-hmm,
are my boys. I am a partner. Angelique is my wife.
mm-hmm,
I am the son of Henry and Helen Green of Chester, South Carolina, and Charles City, Virginia. I am a narrative disruptor, which is a title that I gave myself, but I hope I'm living up to, which
Kuji
is to say
Chagalia.
that, say again,
Kuji Chagalia. Name ourselves, define ourselves, and speak for ourselves. Narrative disruptor.
there you go. I have lived a very blessed life, even with some of the strife
Mm,
and pain that I've experienced. And by that, I mean, I don't think my existence is that far away from many people,
mm,
save the lessons and mentors that have allowed me to have a different perspective on some of the things that I've gone through and some of the things that I've witnessed, uh, allowing me to use my story and my narrative to disrupt harmful stories and narratives about people who share
mm-hmm,
similar spaces as I do. And it's something that I take very seriously. So I'm a storyteller,
mm-hmm,
and my story personally doesn't even start with me, as none of our stories start with ourselves. My story goes back generations and is influenced by many people in my family. I like to think of how the sacrifices my grandmother specifically made
mm,
turned into the sacrifices my parents were able to make, which turn into the privilege that I am now capable to use to try to continue the good work of many generations of my family that have been resilient and fought back, but still known and been able to share joy in the face of dark times,
Mm.
hard times. I don't want to say
Mhm.
dark times, hard times. Um, so I grew up in a military family, and I think that did a few things for me. Um, uh, it helped me learn how to say goodbye and hello quickly and effectively.
Oh,
You know, I when you're a military kid, you have if you're going to have friends, you're going to have to learn how to meet people. I went to 5 different elementary schools, and
wow.
so before we settled down, and so that is something where even though I have a lot of anxiety, I can walk into spaces, and I've been able to create tools that create connectivity.
Mm.
And that even before I could use that language like I'm using now to explain
Mhm.
it, I didn't know what I was doing. I was surviving. I was trying um, to have what I think humans instinctually want, which is to connect with other people.
Absolutely.
Uh, and then also the goodbye part, which is, I think, for me, something that I've always been trying to find balance with. It's okay to let go, but sometimes I let go too much. And
Mm.
there are people who I wish I would have held on to closer, and things that I wish I would have held on to closer.
Mm.
And so, not woulda, coulda, shoulda that space, but more trying to use it as a reflection for when I have the opportunity again. You know, I can be intentional about that space, knowing how I felt about how things have gone in the past. Uh, I grew up in a household with a father who was an alcoholic. And I think I bring that up in this space for a couple of reasons. One, obviously, there is some tinge of the fact that we're going to be talking about substance use
Sure.
in this space, but um, I think I more want to sort of represent the lack of tools my father was given growing up to
Mm.
deal with the amount of pain and trauma that he
Yes.
went through. You know, coming from the South during the Great Migration, his father dying when he was 10,
Mm.
and his mother doing whatever it took to, you know, keep the family going. He was at South Carolina State University in 1968 when there was an uprising of students and a murder by the local police of 3 individuals on that campus, one of which was his close friend. Um, and then he was drafted into Vietnam. And
Mm.
so, uh, and while he did not see direct combat, just being a black man drafted into the military in
Absolutely.
1968, and all that that brought with it,
Mhm.
you know, I'm not surprised that that's what he leaned on, because
Mhm.
that's what people leaned on. You lean
Mhm.
on the crutch that you're given, and
Mhm.
sometimes that crutch holds you while you heal, and sometimes that crutch becomes a permanent part of your existence until it breaks, right?
Mm.
And his crutch broke when I was 16, and that's when he was lucky enough to get into recovery, wise enough, lucky enough, blessed enough, uh, and unfortunately, not in enough time for me to be able to learn from his recovery. And so it became a part of who I was also, even though I, you know, lived in a nicer time. There was a lot of pain and strife and
Mhm.
racial trauma based on where I grew up, like things from my childhood that I didn't have a language to explain,
Mhm.
and two undiagnosed mental illnesses that also, as a part of the upbringing of 2 very poor parents, you know, you don't really have time for emotion. You got to go to work,
Yeah.
da 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 da. And if you are dealing with something, you're not dealing with it in a way that other people see it, right? So
And the
I
cultural
ended up,
underpinnings, a lot of times people are not open to seeing that, or the stigma even prevents the ability to try to open up about it.
yeah, and I think that's, I think shame,
For
right? And
sure.
when we think about the role of stigma, it is sort of the manifestation of shame, right? And
Yep.
it's in all aspects of our life, unfortunately. The desire to not be embarrassed or called out
Mm-hmm.
or seen as weak or whatever it is. And yeah, and you have a very prideful people,
Mm-hmm.
right, who have gone through and survived so much, and surviving being a part of our identity. It seems like you should be able to just figure it out,
Mm-hmm.
or in our case, give it up to Jesus.
Yes.
Um, and it's funny, you asked me that question at the beginning that's going to be at the end, and
Mm-hmm.
I'm like, yep, I want to talk about that, and I want to talk about that, and
Do it.
these are some things we need
Do
to
it.
undo.
Talk about all of it
So
right now.
I'm trying to hold on to the
Uh-uh.
one that I'm going to
Be
like
organic.
unravel at the end.
Yeah, exactly.
Um, but
Let the rest
no,
flow.
let the rest flow. Yeah, I think that it's all played a part though, because even now when I think about what I do, a lot of that performer in me came from church,
Mm.
right? Seeing how people were able to invoke emotion and feeling using parables and stories and attaching them to moral lessons, and when it was done
Mm-hmm.
really really good.
Mm-hmm.
And even before I knew I was listening to great storytellers, I've been receiving great stories from the get, right? And in different styles, because we were a military family. Sometimes we went to church on base, sometimes we went to church and our church homes in Chester and Charles City. And I just got this plethora of learning on how to connect with people and to get them to move, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or to feel moved,
Mm-hmm.
and all of those things start to sink into who you are. And I think, my rebellion against family also ended up being a rebellion against organized religion. And I got into spoken word poetry, and that is its own church
For sure.
of sorts. The whole idea, the same thing is happening, different morals, different rules, different values being displayed, but we're trying to invoke, we're trying to move people, we're trying to connect, and we are naming ourselves, and we're naming our feelings, and we're naming the things around us in the world that we want to see changed or better. And I've spent many, 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 many years in those spaces at open mics, hosting,
Mm-hmm.
and all of that sort of culminating with a life dedicated to youth development into this space where I am right now, which is um, as someone who is still cultivating his own ability to tell a story, but
Mm-hmm.
more concerned about creating a world where other people can use story in the same way that I have, as far as the intentional reflection, the filling in of our past so that we feel less in chaos about our future,
Mm-hmm.
understanding that we all have legacies that we've been building, and that maybe our preoccupation with entertainment or other people's stories have gotten us to forget how precious and important our own story is.
Mm.
And I think also, maybe above all of that, is the realization that while there are things that happen to us, that ultimately we have the opportunity to be the primary authors of our own character and our own story, based on how we teach ourselves to respond to the things that happen to us.
Mm.
Um,
I want to dive
yeah.
into this because I hear you pulling forward a thread that I thought was a really beautiful way you described your father at the beginning, which was he was never given the tools to deal with all of the pain and suffering. And I don't think you used the word trauma, but I'll use the word trauma here that he experienced in his life. And I hear you talking about, and you mentioned it quickly, but I want to make sure to pull it out, the work that you do with youth and helping them be the author of their own story, because that's part of the pain and suffering and trauma, right? When you don't have the skills, you're just along for the ride. But when you are fortunate enough to have someone who can give you some skills, then you can pick up the pen and you can start writing the story either in advance of or in response to the experiences that you have. So, can we dig deeper into that youth work that you're doing and how giving them the pen, I know it's the proverbial pen, but right, like
Hmm.
giving them the proverbial pen to write their own stories helps to try to equip them in a way your father was not equipped and in a way your father was not equipped to equip you.
Yeah. Um, I'll say this. I'll start with, for context, I am a person in long term recovery.
Hmm.
And the height of my active use was in when I was living in upstate New York. And it was in between a time where I was a theater student and then dropped out of theater because that's not what I wanted to do in my life. Picked up spoken word poetry and started competing and touring, and then landed in upstate New York, which was a beautiful place that I made it to way too early in life. Like, it was not enough stuff going on. Now,
Uh-huh.
like, as I'm getting closer to like retirement, it looks beautiful. Back then, idle hands, right? And so I went up
First
there
of
for a
all, are
good
you like
reason.
25 years old talking about retirement? But anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm for the audience, I'm 42. It don't crack until it breaks. And you go from, Denzel to
42 to
Morgan.
82, right? From
It's like you
Denzel
were
to
you were just
Morgan.
35. You were 35 2 days ago. And how are you Morgan Freeman? Um and it's funny now because I'm so old at this point that, like, even the Denzel joke doesn't hit with but a certain generation,
Right,
because we're all
right,
thinking of the same Denzel, but not the one that was just an
right,
Equalizer 3.
right,
Yeah.
exactly. But I'm sorry,
Um,
go ahead.
no, that's fine. That's fine. Uh, I was offering context just because up until I got into recovery, and I ended up about a year in recovery losing a friend of mine, a close
Hmm.
friend of mine from upstate New York, that I ever really understood what writing could be used for, what
Mm-hmm.
it what it meant, what it could mean to me. Up until that point, I had, I wanted to be famous. I wanted to, I went from being an actor to doing spoken word poetry. Oh man, my apologies.
That's all right. Real life.
Real
I think
life.
probably heard my phone buzzing a couple times too. I finally put on
uh,
D&D.
Yeah, no, yeah. I was like, I had a call before this, and I'm like, I'm walking around cleaning, and I need to put my phone on ring because otherwise I'm not gonna feel it buzz. And
Oh,
then, yeah, and
here we
then I
are.
forgot. Here we are. So yeah, fast forwarding to this space where I'm going up to New York for my friend's funeral,
Mm,
and I have an opportunity after the funeral, or a crossroads, if you will, a place in life where I think a big choice. And I didn't understand how big it was until many years later.
mm,
But after the funeral, I could have gone back to the bar where we all lived for many years and where I knew everybody would be. And I could have done what is an unfortunate um, practice or habit in a community of active use, which is trying to fill in the hole of a loss
mm,
with the same thing that took the person,
mhm,
right?
mhm,
That person was in pain and they were trying to deal with their pain.
mhm,
You're in pain now. And for me, having been a year into the sobriety from my drug of choice, I knew that there was a really good chance that if I had tried to do the amount of drugs equal to the hole in my chest from his loss, I probably would have, I could have lost my life also.
yeah.
And so instead, I went back to the hotel and I wrote a poem. And when I'm sharing this story with young people now, I show them that it's not about the thing, it's not about what your poetry is. It's about having something that when the phones don't answer and
Mm.
the music doesn't connect and the people aren't there for you in the way that you need them to be there for you, what is that thing that you can go through or go
Mm.
to get through what you're, you know? And so I said, in this case, poetry saved my life, right?
Mhm.
And I try to share with the young people that I work with in these spaces, whether it be when I was doing the after school creative writing clubs and the spoken word clubs, or now as I'm going around talking about prevention and recovery, like, what is your poetry? Like, what is the thing that you know right now gets you through a hard time? Because I can guarantee you more hard times are coming. So how do we start developing
Mhm.
these tools intentionally? Right.
Mhm.
So that when it does happen, because I get this, you know, people say this all the time. I had nothing to do. I didn't know what to do with my hands. I didn't know what to do with the pain. I didn't know what, and but if I ask you, like, what's your favorite thing to do on a rainy day, and you're like, read a book, right, or play outside in the rain, or go for a hike, or what, you know, like, you can list things that you do instinctually. And so, needless to say, I wrote the poem. I come back to Northern Virginia, and it had been a while since I'd done spoken word poetry in public because I was having a problem. I think a lot of folks in art do when they get into recovery, of separating their use from their creation.
Uh-huh.
And
Yes.
so I hadn't created anything that I thought was worth sharing for a while, but I had this new poem and I wanted to share it. I got my first feature at a space in the area, and I shared the poem. And in the audience was a woman who ran a after school program for foster students that are in
Uh-huh.
foster care, so where they go in
Mhm.
between. And she was like, hey, come read your poem and tell your story to these young people. And no one had ever asked me to do that before. Like, as a poet, if you see my catalog before this poem and after this poem, you know, this is a extraordinarily vain person who doesn't quite have his moral bearings in the world, right? He's
Mm.
talented, the words sound good, but like, the
Mm.
things that he's grasping at are shallow at best.
Mm.
And so no one ever asked you to tell me more about the shallow poem you wrote, right? But when I emoted in this particular way, it was like, hey, you shared something that I know these young people can connect with. Would you be willing and to come in to show them that they are not alone
You
in
moved
what they're
the
feeling?
spirit. You
Yeah.
moved the spirit.
Yeah. And so they brought me in, and I sat down, and first I tried to be a performer because I was insecure, and I wanted them to clap for me and think I was good at what I did. And then they started asking me questions, and it became a conversation, and I took
Mhm.
my cool off and they took their shields off, because
Mhm.
when you're that kind of young person in that kind of space, gone through having gone through what they had gone through, you carry a lot of
Gotta
armor
protect
with you.
yourself for sure.
um and especially from random people that come in who act like they have something you need, right?
Mhm.
That sends off signals for folks,
Mhm. Mhm.
warnings. And so I realized in that moment, and you know, I've been able to reflect on this thousands of times since, but I think instinctually in that moment, I realized that if I really wanted to connect with people, I would have to learn how to connect with myself first, right? I'd have to be able to offer them something authentic if I wanted something authentic in return.
Yeah.
And I think I ran maybe a little too fast at first into writing about who I really was and my feelings and things of that sort. And I say really fast, maybe a little too fast, because I probably could have used a little bit of therapy also. So I didn't put all of it into that space. But nonetheless, I realized I had something, and I realized that there were other people, young people, that needed that something also.
Mhm.
And so,
Mhm.
with zero experience at the beginning, a friend, a now really close friend, was like, hey, come and talk to my students after school. They want to do a poetry club. And 36 clubs, 6 years, uh, hundreds of open mics, tournament scholarships, yada 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 later. Um, you know, and some training now, some
Uh-huh.
actual training. I come to this place where I understand that and I lost my way for a moment. But the thing that I'm giving them is not the ability to be good performers, right? It's the the process of writing. There's just two things that are happening. Um, One, you are tuning into your past self because you can't create anything that isn't already a part of you, right?
Mm-hmm.
um and you are also, when you're doing it well, I think you're freeing yourself by forgiving yourself before you even make a mistake that you might be embarrassed by, and allowing yourself to get into a flow state
Mm-hmm.
where you are becoming a vessel for all of that thought and wisdom and training and life experience. And so when people ask me, and people ask me flippantly sometimes back in the day, especially when I was, out really a disciple of spoken word poetry and poetry workshops, like, does the world really need more poets? And my response to folks is, I'm not trying to create a world of more poets. I'm trying to create more poetically minded people, right?
Mm.
Because when I sit back and I write, I practice self-forgiveness, I practice reflection, and then I practice the ability to pull reason from the things that have happened to me so that I get to choose what I learned from this lesson, from this thing that happened.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that have always one of the quotes that I think has always bothered me, that the platitudes that people throw around, is that everything happens for a reason.
Mm-hmm.
And that's great if that's what you believe, and if you are able to stop at that as your, like, all you need to be satisfied in the universe is to know that things happen for a reason. Cool. I don't think most people are like that, and I
Mm.
feel that most people walk away from that statement feeling unsatisfied.
Mm.
And so when I say poetically minded people, people who can reflect and think forward, it's no matter whether or not you believe things happen for a reason, it is our responsibility to pull reason from the things that happen. And you
Ooh,
have to
say that again,
learn,
Joseph.
whether or not you believe things happen for a reason, it is our responsibility to pull reason from the things that happen.
Mm.
And
I
that's
felt
how
that.
yeah, and that's how we build our rudder, right? This is how we start to understand that I have a place in things that happen to me, even if I didn't want those things to happen to me,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like the moment the initial thing happens, if I'm practicing mindfulness, if I'm practicing intention, if I'm practicing uh the emotional maturity, uh I am giving myself the ability to respond in a way that is in sync with the best version of myself, or the version of myself that I want to
Want
be,
to be.
when there
Yep.
aren't stressful things happening, right?
Yep. Yep.
Um, and
And
that's a
so it's
practice, and that's what. Yeah, go ahead, please. I know I've been chatting.
no,
I've been talking
no,
too
no, no,
much.
no. It's a practice. And so it's like what's beautiful about your work and what I think is like 2.0 on addiction, the book is how do we equip our young people, especially, but also ourselves as no longer the youngest members of the human race, to find the reason in the things that happen. And so I'm definitely not getting paid, although people will think I am, to this PQ program that I'm doing because I talk about it all the time. I've like become a PQ evangelist. And it talks about the sage mindset. Sounds a lot about what you were saying. There's acceptance. The sage mindset approaches hardship in two ways: acceptance, which is everything happens for a reason, or acceptance and convert it to an opportunity or a gift, which is the next step that you're teaching the young people to take, right? Find the reason in the thing that happened and learn from it what you want to learn from it.
Yeah, yeah. I love that, and I think so. I think the part of it that I've added in there, I think is a response to, I feel I feel that when people are looking for the motivation to change, or the courage to face something difficult, or
Mm.
the ability to work through a trauma or a mental health issue, um, that the sound bitiness of the world throws out certain things
Yes.
without making them tangible, right? And so, coming from a church background, it tends to stop with give it to Jesus. Everything happens for a reason. God has a
Mm-hmm.
plan.
Mm-hmm.
Great. I don't want to isolate those people, right? But there's that old parable or story that someone tells, and I've heard it a dozen times, a dozen different ways. But like, a guy is in the middle of the boat crashes, and he's on a raft, and a guy comes by on a boat and is like, "Hey, do you want to ride?" He's like, "No,
Oh,
I trust God. God, I'm waiting for God." And then like the
right.
Navy comes by and they're like, "Do you want
The
to pick us up?"
Navy.
"No, no, no. I'm waiting for God. God's got me." And then like eventually he just dies of starvation. He gets up to
Yeah.
heaven, and God was like, he was mad at God. He's like, "Why didn't you come and save me?" He's like, "I sent you a raft. I sent you the
Mm-hmm.
Navy. I sent
Mm-hmm.
you all of these things." The understanding, the acceptance of the hardship of existence is only half. It's like saying
Mm.
recovery is equal to sobriety. And
Mm.
and it's not, right? Like, the sobriety is a tool in my recovery. My recovery
Mm-hmm.
is trying to live every day the best version of myself. And the best version of myself needs to live and love and laugh and risk and be able to get out in the world and connect
Mm-hmm.
again and get
Mm-hmm.
over the things that I thought I needed the crutch of the substance to deal with. But if I just am dealing in the unnegative space,
Mm-hmm.
right, of not doing a thing,
Right.
then I put myself in a box. And what I really want to do is put the substance in a box, and then I want to live in the infinite space that's around it,
Oh,
where
that
it's
gave me
not, you know what I mean?
chills. I love it. I love
Yeah.
it. I love it. All right, listen.
Yeah.
First of all, this
Go ahead.
conversation went too fast, which I knew that it would, because even when you're just talking, you just sound like a narrative disruptor. Like, you're just like laying the words down, and my ears are like, yes, more. And my soul and my spirit. But the time has come, Joseph. You have already taught us so many things to unlearn, so many things to think about undoing, so many conversations to uncover. But you're going to leave us with one. And what is it?
um a little bit of context real quick, just for
Mm-hmm.
before we press record, I let you know that my father had passed away.
Mm-hmm.
This is the first real work thing I've done since, just the funeral was a day ago. And so I've been thinking about parenting. My oldest son lives in New Mexico with his mother's, and he was here for the funeral, and I just put him on the plane to go back this morning. And I sat in the parking lot outside of the airport and
Mm-hmm.
wept.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a cleansing, right? It was a good thing. There was just so much emotion and so many things, and I needed to get past that swelling. And a thought came into my head about parenting, and I think that I would like to share that
Yes.
as my moment today. And it's it's about the difference between questioning yourself and intentional reflection. I think that a lot of times when we're in these high pressure spaces, and what higher pressure space than that of a parent, the guiding of a person's life and of people's lives. And we are trained, I think, maybe through Western culture or whatever it is, that like we have to be decisive and we can't
Mm-hmm.
second guess ourselves, because if we start questioning ourselves, then the people who are following us are going to start questioning themselves, and then we're just going to be a society that doesn't, is not decisive and doesn't get things done because there's so many questions. And when I think about how I want to show up for my children, I have to reflect on how I've shown up for my children, right? I have to look
Mm-hmm.
back at those moments and say, not I wish I would have done that better, but could I have done that better? not because I did it bad, but because my commitment is to being the best parent I can be. And in the same way, a football player would go back and look at film
Look
of a
at the
performance
tapes.
that happened in the past, look at the tapes. What was your footwork right? What could you have done better in that route? The same thing I think we should do with ourselves. If we love ourselves, and if we are acting in love for the people that have, either by just sheer they got, you brought them here on this planet, or you work with them, or however it is, if there's love for that person, that partner, those people, it is our responsibility to look back at how we've acted and find better ways to exist, even if it's just an inch further. That's an inch of a gift that we're giving to the people around us. And the more we can give them, the more we can open ourselves up to receive from them. And that is the kind of world that I want to live in the kind of world I want to give my children.
Beautiful. Thank
That's
you.
what's on my heart today. Thank you.
I receive it. I receive every bit of it. So thank you for joining us in celebration of your father and in healing of using your gifts to fill the hole that I know is left, but the gift that can come from it. Thank you for being on with us today.
Yeah. Thank you for the conversation. I loved it. It was lovely.
I loved it. I loved it so much. Thank you so much for tuning in. And if you like this episode, please check out my book, Unaddiction: 6 Mind-Changing Conversations That Could Save a Life. Available at Barnes & Noble, bookshop.org, Union Square and Company, Amazon, and wherever books are sold. If you liked this episode, please share it with someone you think may need to hear it. Also, please subscribe to this podcast and leave a 5-star review. That helps us reach any and everyone who may be looking for support in the face of addiction.